All right, I'll introduce you, and
All
we'll
right.
be up in 5 minutes.
Sure, thank you.
Good morning, everyone, on this glorious first day of spring. Thank you all for coming out. I promise if I could have figured out a way to have this out on the plaza, I would have. Instead, we are delighted to be in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium of the two Mississippi Museums. I am Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, and I have not, please silence your cell phones. A few words about upcoming events. Tomorrow evening at 6, the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum will have the second in their new Under the Light series, From Slavery to Emancipation, featuring Darrell White from Natchez discussing the United States colored troops, and Chuck Yarborough from Columbus discussing emancipation. That event is free. Please come by and check that out. Then Thursday and Friday of next week, Belhaven University theater students will perform adaptations of 19th century ghost stories at the Manship House Museum. That's always a good program. The 31st annual Natchez Powwow will be Saturday, March 30th and Sunday, March 31st at the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians. If you've not been to that, you owe it to yourself at some point to check it out. It is the only powwow in North America that's held on a mound site, and it's really great. Then join us back here next week when Karen Evers and Dr. Luke Lampton will be our speakers. They'll discuss their new book, A Photographic History of Medicine in Mississippi. Today, we are delighted to have Christian Pinnen presenting Complexions of Empires, Race and Slavery in Colonial Natchez. Christian has a book coming out on this topic, or is working on a book that's under contract, but he wanted to actually give his History is Lunch presentation during the run of Spirits of the Passage, which is the special exhibit on the second floor of this building that tells the story of the transatlantic slave trade through rare artifacts from the wreckage of a slave ship and artifacts from West Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Museum members get in free to that exhibit, or you can purchase tickets at the lobby desk. It's here through August. If you've not seen it yet, today is a great opportunity, but be sure that you see that before it goes away. Christian Pinnen is an associate professor of history at Mississippi College. He began his studies in the North America program at the University of Bonn and University of Cologne, Germany, and earned master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Southern Mississippi. Pinnen is working on two books, Complexions of Empires, Race, Slavery, and the Law in the Natchez District, 1720 to 1820, under contract with the University of Georgia Press. The second project, co-authored with Charles Weeks, is titled A Borrowed Land, A History of Colonial Mississippi, under final review with University Press of Mississippi. Help me welcome Christian Pinnen.
Good afternoon. That was the most Southern thing I've ever done, I think, with such a good audience. Welcome, everybody. I appreciate everybody coming. I'm glad you're here. I would like to echo Chris's remarks on the Spirits of the Passage exhibit I walked through. It's very, I think moving is the wrong term. It makes things come very realistic to how enslaved people made their way across the Atlantic to our shores. But today, I'd like to talk about Natchez. And when we think about Natchez, for the most part, we think about this, right? We think about and that's how it's usually portrayed as, and it's marketed as this prototypical antebellum Southern town, with what one historian called a white-pillared past. Seeking to attract tourists to Natchez in the 1920s, the Garden Club founded the Natchez Pilgrimage. Today, it's a biannual event. I'm sure most of you know this. It's held in the spring and the fall when the climate and temperatures are nice. Not the summer. And this event brings a lot of tourists, which are deeply important to the regional economy, to the small town. And these tourists usually indulge in a place where, and this is straight from the marketing material, where the Old South still lives. And so the Garden Club has created, according to House and Garden, and I quote them here, the Mecca of charm for the nation. A tourism event that yearly draws more than 230,000 visitors and that generates an estimated $83 million. This is in 2006. It has since gone down, I believe, a little bit. And it's massive. And so through the town's historic mansions, the ladies of modern Natchez recreate a past lost through the Civil War. So they attempt to reestablish links to this past by tracing the current inhabitants of selected homes to the elites of the Cotton Kingdom, ancestors like the Miners, the Dunbars, the Holmeses, Davises, and so forth. And according to Stephen Hulcher, and I quote him here, when an old home like the Briars is fortunate to count the women or the woman who eventually married Jefferson Davis as one of its earliest inhabitants, lineage trumps all other stories, end quote. But when you do that, when you focus your town's history on this one group of people, you miss a whole lot more. You miss everybody else. And there's a reason. In the 1920s, they strategically looked at only white elites for all the reasons that you would find in the 1920s. And it really wouldn't sell any tickets. For example, to trace one's lineage to Jeremiah Bryan. Bryan makes an appearance in the court records of the 1780s, my period, when his neighbor, George Weigel, informed the Spanish governor that, and I quote, "A certain Jeremiah Bryan has against decency and humanity bitten and struck your petitioner in the testicles." Such behavior was unseemly for a Natchez nabob, as you might imagine. Similarly, though, Jacob Holmes would also not make a stellar ancestral example of the Natchez Pilgrimage. Citizens found his body in the gallery of John O'Connor's house on one December morning in 1791, and concluded that his, and I quote, "his death had proceeded from intoxication and being exposed to the cold all night." Now, these men never make it any of the histories, but they are, like the people that inhabit these houses, white. Yet it is these people that generated the wealth that made the white pillared past possible. And it's these people that I will want to turn to. Now, in fairness, in Natchez, things are changing. We have the program that's here in the African American Museum, right? That's through a person who does a lot to bring African American past in Natchez alive. We have, of course, the William Johnson House. We have the African American History Museum. There are now markers at the Forks in the Road Slave Market, and the National Park Service has more things that it's doing to bring back the African American past. There's a walking tour and so forth. So things are changing. But my focus is always on these people, and they are much, much harder to trace, and to tell their stories is much harder than the elite white folks. So let me give you 3 episodes that sort of encapsulate what I'm trying to do in my book and in my research. The first comes from 1722, when, for the first time, enslaved Africans became pawns between the French colonists and Natchez Indians, as both began to sort of lead an imperial contest about the place where they both wanted to live. The Natchez people were concerned with the growing new French outposts on the banks of the Mississippi River and the concomitant expansion of French settlers and their plantations. So warriors attacked one of the outlying plantations, St. Catherine's Creek, which is here. This is an old French map. But targeted not the white French people, but the enslaved African people. They're killing one and they wounded another. By doing so, the Natchez let on that they understood the meaning of what we understand as race and simultaneous definitions of slavery and freedom. And they take these to the center of imperial issues in the region. The Natchez had obviously observed the treatment of Atlantic Africans by the French, and the natives were well aware of black people's social standing in French society. The natives also clearly understood that the enslaved Africans were essential to the French to sustain a successful colony this far north from New Orleans. And they had become aware of the African status as unfree based on their complexion, their skin color, not based on captivity alone, which the Natchez practiced captivity like any other Indian nation at the time. But there's a difference between that and what the French were practicing. Immediately before the incident, the savages, and this is a quote, were talking to the Negroes who had stopped to eat, potentially trying to entice them to leave the enslavers. When that failed, again, this is the quote, about 4 savages fired on 6 Negroes who had been cutting wood, end quote. One of which, Bougou, died from the wounds. The French recognized the danger and began to move their enslaved people closer to the plantation and eventually into the safety of the buildings. The French enslavers sheltered their investment and shielded the enslaved from further attacks, probably hoping this would remain an isolated incident. Yet, as we will see, this was only the beginning of a struggle that involved people of all complexions in Natchez. The next years required a deft understanding of the pitfalls inherent in the system of complexions employed by the French to create hierarchies based on skin color, one that the French were fatally unable to manage. So now we jump, right? This is my first example. This is the second one. Natchez is now a much more established place, but it's now no longer French, now it's Spanish. 7 years later, a free woman of color took a more active role to maneuver the fault lines of imperial conflict. As the Natchez district transitioned from Spanish to American rule between 1797 and 1798, Amy Lewis had bound her future closely to the Spanish governor, Manuel Galloso de Lamas, and to Spanish law. Her owner had died, and in his will freed her and their son. However, the owner's sister, an Anglo-American settler, contested the will and attempted to re-enslave the two. Defending her freedom, Lewis begged Galloso to take her and her case with him to his new post in New Orleans. He had become the governor of all of Louisiana. Lewis implored that she saw, and I quote her here, no prospect of a speedy determination and the pangs of suspense being more terrible to her than the most dreadful certainty, so she begs your excellency to grant her permission to remove her suit to the tribunal at New Orleans, where a more speedy decision may in all probability take place. This does not occur, and Lewis will eventually lose her case when the Spanish and Galloso leave Natchez, upon which event she was re-enslaved and sold. Now Lewis tried to negotiate an advantageous outcome to her case in a landscape in which the meaning of complexion, slavery, and freedom had been constantly shifting for decades. And the last seismic move of the imperial landscape cast Lewis into the chasm of American slavery from which she never escaped. I never find her again in the archives anywhere. So these sort of bookend my book in many ways. There will be more examples later. But for the purpose of this talk, I want to focus you on the period in the middle, the English period, or British period, because it signifies a change, and it's a slow change, in attitude and into how Europeans interpreted the meaning of blackness as they begin to explore, settle, and exploit labor in the lower Mississippi Valley. So lower Mississippi Valley obviously starts in New Orleans, and it's this region right here. The book that you see here, and there was a talk last week, I believe, over in the courthouse actually by somebody who has edited this book. It's fairly important because it's one of the few large scientific surveys of the lower Mississippi Valley at the time. But the author, Bernard Romans, aims to introduce the reader to this vast stretch of land, to all of what is West and East Florida, British West and East Florida, all of this. And he talks about everything. Native Americans, as we'll see in a second, flora, fauna, animals, land, how much cotton can you grow, how much sugar can you grow, you can't, tobacco, and so forth. And he very quickly tells the reader what he believes is the future key to prosperity here. Colored by his belief that, and I quote him, the primal mobile of the welfare of their inhabitants are the African slaves, he then continues to argue, and I put this up here because it's a longer quote, I cannot in conscience forbear to give my advice to all adventurers in Florida who desire to improve a plantation for their benefit, not to forget these useful, though inferior members of society, not but poor families may live in plenty, and by honest labor acquire a comfortable and easy situation in life as may wish for, but until their industry helps them to the means of buying one slave, and so on, till they get more, it will be vanity for them to hope for an accumulation of wealth. All right, so right from the beginning, everyone that wants to read this book and wants to be informed of what to do in this region, you have to utilize slavery to do anything, really. Now, to the British traveler and to the people that read this in 1775, enslaved Atlantic Africans were uniquely qualified and, in his mind, deserving of their fate. And he begins to use race differently than we do today and than the French had done before him. And so this concept of race becomes really important to understand. And historians and scholars of literature have begun to peel back what actually happened in the 18th century and what it means when people describe black people, white people, and so forth. But before we can sort of delve deeper into what he means by when he says race or complexion, let's look at some definitions of race in the modern sense. Barbara Fields is one of the leading historians on racial relations in the US, and she is very clear in defining that race is not an element of human biology, like breathing oxygen or reproducing sexually. Nor is it even an idea, like the speed of light or the value of pi, that can be plausibly imagined to live an external life of its own. Race is not an idea, but it's an ideology. And that's fairly important to understand, right? It's something that's artificially introduced into our society. Another theoretical approach to this would be by Professor, I'm probably butchering his name, Vihilihe, who construes that race, racialization, and racial identities as ongoing sets of political relations that require, through constant perpetuation via institutions, discourses, practices, desires, infrastructures, languages, technologies, science, economics, dreams, and cultural artifacts, the borrowing of non-white subjects from the category of the human as it is performed in the modern West. So even today, we have trouble with race, not in the sense that we have trouble with racial, not just in the sense that we have trouble with racial connections, but just by defining it. How do we really define it? And that's the problem. It's flexible, and historically always has been flexible. It makes it really hard for us to read back from our understanding of what it means into these really 200-year-old sources. What did they mean? What did they mean by that? And the problem is, of course, that most of these sources are exclusively written by white people or published for white people, which also colors our understanding. And so before the Age of Revolution really separated many of the slaveholding colonies from their respective empires. So before the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the revolutions in the Spanish colonies, racial concepts were much harder to define. And so let me get back to Natchez then. Because the problem with Natchez is that historians, if you read books on historical Natchez, for the most part, they sort of glance over the colonial period. Right? They write these books, or the books that are out there, are usually written to explain antebellum Natchez, what happened in the white pillar past, not what happened before. But that's actually quite important, because we're talking about a period of time where nobody can predict how wealthy slavery and cotton can make people, and there's no certain outcome that the Americans will actually hold on to the district or actually ever get to the district. And that's problematic. We find this, though, in many, many books, and these are just a few that if you're interested in something, please go ahead and read those. But even those books, which are larger books on this idea of the slave country, which the lower Mississippi Valley will become, and all of these outlooks make no sense if we don't understand Natchez's colonial history, because it's not really a slave country yet in 1775. Nor was it necessarily destined to become one when the French began to settle it in earnest in the early 18th century. For the next century, almost exactly 2 centuries until Mississippi becomes a state, the area was inhabited by a complex group of people, Native Americans, Atlantic Africans, and various Europeans, who in turn shaped social manifestations of race, slavery, and imperial expansion. Captivity, bound labor, and other modes of production consistently drove the region toward the nascent market economies of Europe, but there were multiple moments in which the eventual outcome was very much cast in doubt. It would be a mistake, then, to ascribe a hegemonic singularity to the borderlands past in the 18th century, in the 18th and early 19th century. So, that's the more theoretical part of what I'm talking about. So let me try and bring up and connect some dots. European theories in the 18th century about complexion, what we would call race today, and how it allowed them to deploy enslaved African labor did have a very strong link to the region, right? Without enslaved people, there is no productivity. Like many other descriptions of non-European regions, Romans' travelogue levels a host of perceived savage, and this is in quotes, properties against Native Americans and Africans alike. To him, for example, and I quote him again, the women suffer no more by childbirth than any other savage woman. In this case, he's referring to Native Americans, but he's bringing in a comparison with African people. They retire into a place of solitude at the time, and after delivery return to their daily labor. While he readily admits that one woman in fact died in childbirth during his stay at one of the Native American villages, just a few dwellings over, the common trope of the savage woman, in quotes, that has no trouble giving birth as a marker of an inferior, in his case more primal, being still appears as a powerful reminder to his readers in Europe and in North America that the people he describes are neither white, civilized, nor by extension then Christian. And Christianity here is important because it was specifically not enough to just denounce what the modern reader would identify as racial identifier, blackness, or red for Native Americans. Romans had to employ other cultural signifiers like the savage term to clearly identify his subjects as non-white at every level of definition. Savage denotes more than, in this case non-white, skin color. Other civilizing factors actually enhance the African's blackness, as becomes evident when Roman rhetorically asks, and this is a quote from him, can one say a favorite of mankind, I mean liberty and property, that's him, are anywhere enjoyed in Africa? End quote. To him and his Anglo-American readers, other hallmarks of European civilization and their respective absences also add to a lack of civilization among African people, and in turn contributed to their blackness. In addition, a lack of Christianity allows the enslavement of Africans by righteous Christians without sinning in the eyes of God, the traveler continues. In combination, all three episodes then allow a glimpse into the ways in which people attempted to make sense and in many ways read their surroundings as they attempted to adjust to the intermingling of Africans, Native Americans, and Europeans in the lower Mississippi Valley. For example, the Natchez warriors who opened fire in 1722 specifically targeted enslaved Africans, suggesting that they understood the emerging institution of racial slavery, and showing their determination to be read or seen as not black, as different from African people, maybe whiter. Yet as European discourses on complexion continued throughout the 18th century, savages, as Romans and his contemporaries called them, were not just defined by their skin color, but also judged inferior by their cultural markers, by climate that they came from, by gender roles, by their ability to fit into Christian society, and their willingness to display what you could call cultural whiteness. Skin color did matter, but only as a part of the whole picture. And throughout the Enlightenment period, it was more, and this is another historian, a shifting mosaic than a fixed portrait. Then, by 1798, as Amy Lewis lost her freedom under the rule of American law, interpretations of complexions had begun to change dramatically, as Sharon Block has found. I quote her here, Because by the beginning of the 19th century, skin color began to consistently be privileged as the sign of racial identity in literary, legal, and public arenas. And, again, quote her, skin color became the primary tool to mark slavery, freedom, and presumed innate racial qualities. So that's a big shift. Before that, skin color was one among many definitions that made people inferior. But at the turn of the 19th century, black is inheritable to all of these things. Now they're clearly written on black skin. That's very different than from what people experienced before. Now, ideas of race in a pre-modern sense are crucial to understand the complex relations between people in the lower Mississippi Valley. Throughout the 18th century, European academics residing in universities across England, France, Italy, the core of the Enlightenment, and elsewhere attempted to develop a pseudo-scientific system to explain the blackness of Africans. Through the use and misuse of travelogues, which is simply copied and copied and copied, European writers and academics built a picture of Africa that deeply influenced the discourse of complexion, in particular so in France. Blackness in France became, as one historian argues, a body-based negritude in which the blood, the semen, and the organs of African people were all described as being black or blackish, but not before 1787. Before then, there are different descriptions. Yet, African people before then even were rendered accountable for their own enslavement by 1704, and by 1732, dictionaries established a tautology of black equaling enslaved. Accounts also gender Africans as primarily male, through the use of predominantly male pronouns. So complexion then is a much more accurate term to describe what people were talking about than race. Now the people at the time will use race quite frequently, but they mean something entirely different by it than we understand it today. The English, because these were French people, the English followed a similarly serpentine path to find a way to classify non-white people and their association with captivity. One historian argues that, and I quote him here, when Englishmen thought and wrote about slavery before 1619, before the first African people were brought to an English colony, this is Virginia, they were typically much more concerned about the possibility of their own enslavement than they were with the conditions of African or Indian people. They understand slavery, but they understand it as a way that when they venture into the ocean, they're going to get captured by the Spanish or by any one of the Northern African powers, and then they will come enslaved. So that flips very late. Only in time, throughout the 17th century, really, and the Enlightenment period, this pseudoscience I've talked about, did Englishmen work out the problem as they saw it, and began to identify blackness with slavery in their Atlantic colonies. Before then, they were beholden, like any other Europeans, to the, and I quote here, elastic way that skin color could operate in the 18th century, and about the status Britons accorded to Christian profession. Therefore, our friend Romans again, attempts to classify humans into, let's block, sorry. There's Romans. Classify humans into categories of whiteness and non-whiteness. And they were par for the course. All the travelogues you would read in the 17th or 18th century are like this. Important for modern readers is the way in which Romans and his contemporaries used the word race. His writings, and those of many other contemporary Europeans, are littered with description as the following. I have in my dissertation on the origin of the savages, which has swelled beyond my intention, made mention of a peculiar characteristic of the Negro species. Here, let me be allowed to mention that they, like all others of the different species and varieties of the human genus, are born white. Right, and the quote goes on, but that's the point they're making. Everyone is born white, but it's where you grow up, the climate you grow up in, how much sun you're exposed to. That will eventually turn you black, relatively quickly, actually, as he points out in the quote. That's why we can't use the term race here as we want, because it's contemporarily used differently. So Romans understood blackness as an overall physiological phenomenon, which he connected to blood and bile, and this thinking deeply influenced him and others. Of course, all of these discoveries were unfavorably compared to the European counterparts. Whiteness was deemed to be the standard, blackness the substandard, really any other skin color. Hence, Europeans began to latch on to the ideas that supported, and I quote, the ways that power relationships could be produced through descriptions of bodily features, not just skin color alone. Because of that connection, black people as the black human variety, as these pseudo-scholars called it, slowly begins to crystallize. But concurrently, definitions of human whiteness arose as well. People didn't consider themselves white before the 1600s. Right? This wasn't a thing. People didn't talk about skin color in the ways that we talk about today. So as Europeans in the lower Mississippi Valley worked out the theoretical nature of complexion as they sought to introduce labors they don't have to pay for into their economy, the Natchez District's development as a slave society seemed to continue unabated. These are, for example, sketches of Native American people, of Natchez people. And you might imagine that they don't look particularly darkened skin or anything like that. They look like anyone else. Now you can tell, though, that they're not Europeans by the way they're dressed, or not dressed, rather. Right? So this idea of these are other people is expressed not for skin color, but for dress, cultural markers. But on November 23rd, 1723, there's a French report, and I'm going to do ad lib a little bit here. The French essentially call out a black African leader in or among the Natchez people, and they want him caught and either delivered to them alive or dead. They didn't care. But apparently there was a war leader among the Natchez people that was African, potentially an escaped slave, somebody that had done service for the French in Louisiana. We're unsure, we don't know. And the Natchez would eventually comply. But for the French, this one person was extremely dangerous because he ended their attempts at sort of divide and conquer these people. The French always tried to maintain a stark separation between African people, Native American people, and European people, which the people on the ground didn't care for all that much, but the French in charge wanted to. With this one African working together with the Native Americans against the French, that was their greatest nightmare, because he could have potentially united the two non-white people in the lower Mississippi Valley and driven the French from Louisiana. And that was a very, very real threat to those folks. There are other examples of this behavior more in New Orleans, but I'm going to stick with Natchez for today. Under the British, this is British West Florida just as a map. I do not have a picture that protects the person here. We know of two people of color who had been free in the area. There are a lot of enslaved people. We only know of two free people of color. One of those was Nellie Price. She was operating as a merchant south of Natchez in modern Manchac, actually. But she was engaging with people in the area on a one-on-one basis. She was free, yet black. But the people, the white merchants, the white male merchants, couldn't do anything about her. Like, she was not as hemmed in by legal codes as they might have wished. Again, pointing to the fact, right, that race was not a factor if you couldn't make it stick. And at the time, they couldn't. Complexion didn't matter, right? It mattered how much, what you had to sell, what could you buy. This becomes really significant when we look at the Spanish period. This is a document that it's hard to read, but this is one of the court cases that Amy Lewis is trying to do. When Spain comes to Natchez in 1781, when they go from New Orleans, conquer Natchez from the British, things change dramatically. They conquer Natchez in 1778, but there's no Spanish law until 1781. Things then change. And to borrow from another historian here, what you have is multiple legal systems that are concurrently at work in Natchez. And these legal systems reveal some of the countervailing tendencies of the law of slavery. In particular, competing ideas about Spanish and Anglo-American law, which at times upheld slaveholders' power, but could also recognize an enslaved person's right to freedom. And that's deeply significant. The Spanish allow both enslaved and free people of color more access to courts than the British ever wanted to. And the case that is so important to me personally is Amy Lewis, because I tracked her from Natchez to Texas and back to Spain. She's been with me for a long time. And while her fate ultimately is deeply saddened, she has led me to really want to know more, want to dig deeper into what's going on here. Her freedom ultimately failed. This is that court suit I quoted earlier, right, in 1797. But she is the perfect case to understand what's at stake here, what's clashing between British people, Anglo-American people, and their respective ideas about law, and Spanish people and their ideas about law. Spanish courts were really important institutions for the enslaved, but they were not necessarily fair, nor were they the only way for African people in Natchez to get a hint of freedom, to make use of Spanish tradition. Slave women, for example, often exploited their relationship to white men in gaining freedom if they can, like Amy Lewis did. But when the court cases fail, there's one other institution that might not. And that other institution is the church. This is over in the archives here at MDAH. These are baptism records specifically of African Americans that are baptized in the Catholic Church in Natchez toward the end of the period. And the thing about these records is that the Anglo-American settlers of Natchez did not understand the way that the Catholic Church worked and could be made to work for enslaved or free people of color. The very important thing that they do, and that's where the baptisms come in and are so important, they allow black people, at least in the eye of Spanish law, even though it's within the church, but that had consequences for legal institutions, they allowed women to claim their children as legitimate offspring of whoever the father is. And they would name the father in those baptism records. And then the child had rights. The father would then be asked in front of the church, is this true, are you the father? And usually he would even be there. And he would acknowledge that child's paternity. And that then gives the child the right, for example, to a share of the inheritance. Right? It could make the child free, depending on what the father wanted to do. So they are really important records. And generally in South America and Latin American history, these are extremely important. We don't have many here, but the few we have are quite good in allowing us to do certain things. So, for example, what can happen here? People, no matter their social status, could act free once they established connections to someone at the church or through the church. Acting free could mean white, depending on where you are. Under Spanish law, you could literally get a document that declared you white, even though your skin color is clearly black. There's deep significance in this idea. Slaves sought to use these baptism records, and they sought to tie their family to usually at least one white person through godfatherhood. So in these records, there's always father, mother, child, and then two godparents, which is the Catholic tradition of how we do things. And once Spain and the Catholic Church came to Natchez, Atlantic Africans appeared in very large numbers in the baptism records of Natchez. And that's despite their enslavers certainly not being Catholic. Most people in Natchez were Anglo-American, that means they're Protestant. Right, so the enslaved people are thumbing their nose quite aggressively here by going to the services that their white masters don't want to attend. I can track the people that are in this book, I can track them into the court records. They do not appear. But there's a few things I can tell you. For example, Isaac was baptized on November 28th, 1791. He was the son of a white man named Doshi and of an enslaved woman named Nenny. As godparents, those two parents chose the soldier Jose Garcia and a black woman named Rachel. Because the priest noted that Nenny was enslaved, we can infer that Rachel was free, since he made no mention of her enslavement. The priest also did not record that Isaac, as mentioned above, that Isaac followed his mother's status. So presumably, Isaac was not a slave. Now, we don't know, right? But Isaac now had a legal recourse. If ever he would be enslaved, he could go to the church records under Spanish law, look at them, and see he was not mentioned as an enslaved person, therefore he was free. Right? So these records become deeply important in that moment. The relationship between the parents itself was also somewhat unusual in their larger Anglo-American society. By baptizing the child together as a couple, the father officially acknowledged his paternity, something that was rather rare in the Anglo-American colonies. He may have been a Spanish soldier because the godfather also was a Spanish soldier, but the godmother, probably by design, was likely chosen because of her status as a free person of color. If Isaac was going to become free, he needed somebody to guide. If his mother remained enslaved, he's free. He needed a guide to understand what to do, what not to do in a slave society like Natchez. And it makes it hard to navigate. One last case. And this kind of shows what happens when Anglo-American law, or really American law, snaps back in Natchez. What happens to slavery there? This is a picture from the court records in Natchez. As Natchez became American in 1798, and then governed by U.S. law, first territorial, eventually federal and state law, the chances for freedom or social connections through baptism greatly diminished. The Catholic Church lost influence, a lot of Protestant churches moved in, and the Spanish court's obviously gone. The tone of the manumissions also changed. As skillfully explained by Ava Shepard Wolf, manumissions in American slave societies did not return freedom to the enslaved, but granted it through the grace of the enslaver, meaning that, and this is right where race snaps back in, by the turn of the century, black simply meant slave. Not like before, but that also means that things change. That means that enslavers grant black people freedom. They don't give it back, right, in this early period. Only a white person could be free and therefore bestow freedom on a black person. This is remarkably different from what the Spanish had done, or even the British in the 1760s and 1770s, and certainly different than the French had done. Talked to you about Amy Lewis. She would become a victim of this. But there's another case here before I come to a close that I want to mention. That's Clorinda. In 1808, we have the second or third territorial law code passed in the Mississippi Territory. And her enslaver didn't pay close attention to that code. Because in the code, Joseph Galvan, who is her enslaver, finds out that he actually has to pay a surety. He has to pay money to make sure that Clorinda never becomes a public nuisance or has to be supported through public funds. And when he sees that, he takes her manumission back. He's not willing to pay that amount of money, right, for her to remain free. So again, white people are the arbiters of freedom. There's no natural anything. It's white people decide if people of color are enslaved or free. And he does that even though he expressed his, and I quote him here, consideration of the faithful service of the woman. But that was not enough to validate the price tag that came with freedom for an enslaved person after 1808. And so we can see through these records how this idea of race develops, how an idea of what we modern day call complexion changed into something that was much more akin to race, and then what the aftershocks of those can be, both in legal, social, and cultural terms in colonial Natchez. All right, that is it from me. I appreciate your time and your patience.
Time for questions? If you'll raise your hand, I'll bring you a microphone. Back here.
About the book of baptisms, did you find that in the Louisiana Catholic records on microfilm?
No, in the archives have it.
Well, we have that over there. So
Yeah.
where did you find that, if I may ask?
Just in the records, like you can pull them up. There's a translation.
I mean, in the archives,
Mississippi, Arkansas.
there are millions of records, Christian. What?
Yeah.
So, I mean, Natchez records?
Yeah, it's
Adams County
diocese,
records?
No, the diocese, I forgot I can look it up, hold on. It's
Well,
the diocese
well, I'll
of,
continue on.
Yeah.
Are you planning to publish the inventory that you have made of those baptisms?
I don't think so. Somebody else did. There is a guide to it in the archives.
Okay, so they have been published, the baptisms?
I don't think they've been published, but they're accessible, they're printed, they're typed up.
Okay. We will track that down, because
Okay.
I'm interested in that. Thank you.
Professor, there was an Anglican preacher that was in Virginia, and then he went down to Barbados, and he wrote a treatise in like 1680 that was against slavery. He didn't like Virginia, and he didn't like Barbados. And his name was Godwin. I was wondering if you were familiar, and he went back to England. And it seemed like to me that he was maybe the first abolitionist, or he was against this ideology, and I was wondering if you could speak to that.
I have heard the name. He's not an abolitionist, for sure. The reason being, most problems that British people had with, or at this point in time, English people, with slavery was the question of what happens when these people become Christians. That's why you see a lot of ministers address slavery in their sermons, because they're unsure of what does that mean. If they become Christians, do they then have to become free? Because that's the going definition of what makes you, right? It's because it's not about your skin color, it's about what do you present outwardly. So if you're Christian, you speak English well, you understand the English law, you might hold property, you are really not longer enslavable. And then if you have one person that's not longer enslavable, what happens to everybody else? And for him, it's a matter of Christianity, right? He wants these people to be baptized so they can go into heaven. But he also understands that the people will never do that because of what I just kind of laid out. So it's a really complex issue. He didn't have a problem with servitude at all. That's not his issue. His issue is what happens to these people if they become Christianized.
Good afternoon. My question in reference to the Catholic faith back in the 1400s, have you been able to substantiate that Europe was dying, literally, and the explorers gave 6 slaves to Europe, and that was the actual beginning of trading people?
My research personally doesn't go that far back, but particularly when it comes to the Spanish and the Catholics, Spanish history is way different than, obviously it's Spain, but then the rest of Europe for the most part. Because, for example, the Spanish in the 1400s were a conquered people. They had been pushing back what they called Moors, northern African people, Muslim people who had conquered them in the 8th, 9th century, and they had been fighting ever since to push them back out. So for the Spanish, they consistently dealt with slavery, not just, they were being enslaved and they in turn enslaved other people. Skin color didn't matter to them necessarily. They would enslave anyone who they captured as a prisoner of war and put him on a war galley. There were English enslaved people on Spanish warships, rowing. It doesn't, at this 13th century, 14th century, right? This is also very closely after the Crusades. So we are in really different territory there. I think what you're referring to is the bubonic plague that hits Europe in bad numbers, which has not as much to do with the enslavement of people. But there's a larger Atlantic world that's before the Atlantic slave trade, so before what even the exhibit covers, that has a very different idea about what black people are, what white people are, and what it all means. Thank you.
So I was just wondering if you've done any research on slave owning within the Native American tribes, like the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, like Creek, and if you have, like how you see that affecting the way that race functioned within slavery.
So I have not specifically focused as much on Native American slaveholders in this case, because what happens after the Natchez Rebellion in 1729, they drive the French out of Natchez, and at this point in time I've confined myself to the Natchez district, and neither the Choctaw nor Chickasaw really move in terms of settlement. But we know that the idea of blackness, whiteness, or in self-reflection, redness, the idea that Native Americans are different, distinctly different from Europeans and Africans, is born by the interaction they have with the French. With the 1722 example that I brought up, or the 1723 example, where they see that the French treat African people very differently than they treat other French. There were other French servants in Natchez, and they treat these servants different than they treat their black servants. The Natchez observed that, and then the French bring Native American captives in, and they treat these Native American captives like they treat the African captives. And so the Natchez sort of learn from this and begin to develop their own idea that, no, we are different. And when they learn that, then eventually we will see Native people as slaveholders, just as much as we see white people as slaveholders.
I'm always interested in looking at the past and bringing it up all the way to 2019. And I'm interested in the fact that there was a problem with giving the right to become a Christian. And I look at 2019 and I'm looking at the problem of the right to vote. And what does that mean to the white population? And the right to be educated. And what does that mean to the white population? And how they then begin to function based on the fact that if we give these rights, then what is that going to mean to me? And I think that we need to really think about 2019 as it relates to the same problems that we had back in the 1700s.
Yes, ma'am.
There is slavery and there's racism. And you brought out very well that black became synonymous with slavery. As a Catholic, I know that it was a pope who decided that the world belonged to Spain, and anybody who wasn't Christian was a pagan and an other. And when they decided to move in this direction into the Northern Hemisphere, they identified people to be enslaved. It would be helpful if black people knew that slavery was not invented in Africa, and Africans were free people who were enslaved and brought in this direction. The Bible tells us about slaves throughout, and I believe Asians maybe were enslaved and brought into Africa. I'm not sure about that, but it would be real helpful to white people. Black is not, in fact, slavery. Black people were made slaves.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, but I heard you mention the word savage several times. Back in Natchez, once they became Christians, they were baptized, were they still considered savages?
By the Spanish, no. For the British, it didn't matter. The British always viewed them as distinctly different. Sort of the question that the gentleman asked earlier about the minister in the 1680s, right? To them, it's more of a question of like, what does that mean for us as a Christian community? Can we let these people in? And then how we treat them. Now, the Spanish, again, because of their sustained contact from the end of the Roman Empire, really, to when Columbus in 1492 sails the ocean blue, they always had slavery. So to them, enslaved people of any, today we would call them ethnicities, were fine. They became part of their kingdom of Spain, or before that they were smaller individual kingdoms, and they were brought into the Catholic Church. So that doesn't change their status at all. So they're fine. They were baptizing them left and right, doesn't matter. They were still slaves still. And maybe sort of to your point earlier, historians have begun to be really careful to calling what we generally understand as enslaved people slaves. We call them, particularly in sort of Africa, among Native Americans, we usually begin to refer to them as captives, because what's distinctly different about slavery in the Americas is that that institution is always racial, as we define it. It's never, you're not a prisoner of war and then your child automatically just joins, that kind of thing. There's also not an option like in Africa when you're a captive. African kings had captive armies where people rose to generals that were highly regarded, not just by the king, but by everybody around them, right? But their status was not hereditary. Yet in the New World, in the Americas, your status is hereditary. That is a big difference. That's the qualitative difference that makes slavery here so much different than anywhere else, or even historically, in the longue durée.
Thanks for that presentation. A very quick, simple question. In Natchez, in Natchez, can you hear me? You have at one time, during the 18th century, you have this conquistadors, the Spanish coming, and then the French, and then eventually the British. Of these three European countries that are going to be occupying Natchez, and they all have possessed slaves, and slavery is synonymous with inferiority and labor, poor labor. Of these three European groups, which was the more severe in terms of the way they owned their slaves, of those three? And then the other thing is, I'm wondering, they did have a few blacks who actually owned slaves. Richard Dunbar and others owned plantations, cotton plantation, sugar plantation, and indigo plantation. How were these black owners of slaves treated? Well, we'll stop there.
So these are really good questions. I think the first one, the difference is, and this is no pun intended, is academic. An enslaved person is an enslaved person. And enslavement means, by definition, you are violently kept in a status of submission against your will. And if you do not do what you're told, you will be punished. No matter if the person you're doing it to you is speaking English, French, Spanish, German, Chinese, it doesn't matter. Right? So but academically then, there is a difference, because there are different avenues depending on who you're enslaved under that allow you to go to freedom. But I think if you were an enslaved person in the 18th century, it didn't really matter to you. Like, slavery was extremely cruel, violent, and everything that you're familiar with that comes with that institution. Now, to the second part, and African American or Atlantic African slaveholders are are an expression of the larger Atlantic world. They existed, but they were small minorities. They existed on the outskirts of society. We had a few, in sort of what would become the United States. You have a few in New Orleans, and you have very, very few in Charleston, South Carolina. You have none in Natchez. And in New Orleans, they're again coming out of the French and Spanish periods in which people of color did have different avenues to freedom. New Orleans was a very busy port town. You have a lot of people coming in and out. You have a very high court there. So once you get access to the court, you have avenues to freedom. People took these avenues. They weren't given these avenues. They took these avenues. And then they made money. But to appear whiter for people, they had to then do what white people did to rise in society. And that, for the most part, meant you had to acquire other enslaved people. What also is problematic when you consider African-American slaveholders is what was their goal? If their goal was, like with some of the sugar plantations or smaller operations in Louisiana, to make money, then you have a very, they're very akin to white slaveholders. But a lot of the slaveholders that were African American were actually holding their own families in slavery. Now, this seems very cruel, but in fact, it was the best that they could do because they could not afford, and many, many laws were passed against manumission, so they could buy them and thereby ensure that they would remain with them, with their families. They could keep their families together, but then they can't manumit them because you either need approval by the legislature of the state of Mississippi, Georgia, whatever, or you can free them, but then they have to leave the state within a year or 2 years. So the only way to keep the families together is to play this really high-risk game of maintaining them into servitude, yet sort of living together as a family. The threat here is that if something happens to you, if something happens to, usually it's men, if something happens to the man and he has debts, the legal status of the family is still that of an enslaved person. So they can then be sold off to satisfy the debts by whoever is managing the estate, right? So these avenues are fraught with danger at all times. But most of the statistics that we have of slave owners, of African-American slave owners, are in those cases. They own their own families and they're trying to make do.
We have come to the top of another hour. This has been great. As you can see from the crowd, we will clearly need to keep an eye on Christian's research on his book and have him back when it comes out in a few years. I hope that we see you all tomorrow evening for the Under the Light program. I hope that we see you back here next week. But for now, help me thank Christian Pinnen for this program.
Thank you.